An elderly man, abandoned by his children, left with nothing but his loyal dog, stumbles upon an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, never imagining what was hidden inside. What this elderly man abandoned by his children discovers beyond that broken door would change his life forever and prove that one honest choice can rewrite a future. Subscribe for more powerful stories and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. At 74, Frank Reynolds never imagined his life would end up like this. Once a devoted father and hardworking mechanic in a small Midwest town, Frank now stood alone at the edge of a rain-soaked street, holding a worn duffel bag in one hand and the frayed leash of his old dog in the other. Max, a gray-muzzled Labrador with aching joints and unshakable loyalty, pressed close to Frank's leg as if he sensed the danger of what had just happened. Behind them, the door of his son's house had already closed. No goodbye, no apology. Just silence louder than any argument. Frank didn't shout, he didn't beg. Years of being told he was too much trouble had taught him that dignity sometimes meant walking away quietly. The rain came down harder, soaking Frank's thin coat and blurring the familiar streets he once walked with pride. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, but no one stepped out. Old age had made him invisible. Frank knelt slowly, resting his forehead against Max's. "Well, old boy," he whispered, forcing a smile through the pain. "Looks like it's just us again." With nowhere to go and night closing in, an abandoned road leading toward the woods became their only option. Every step was heavy, but Max stayed beside him. And in that moment, with everything stripped away, Frank still had one thing left, loyalty that refused to leave. The rain didn't slow down as Frank Reynolds and Max left the last streetlight behind. If anything, it grew heavier, colder, each drop soaking deeper into Frank's bones. His boots squelched with every step, the sound echoing in the quiet like a reminder that he no longer belonged anywhere warm or bright. The road ahead narrowed into cracked asphalt, then gravel, then little more than a dirt path leading toward the woods. Frank's breath came in shallow bursts. His chest ached, not just from the cold, but from the weight of what had happened. He had raised his children with calloused hands and late nights. He had skipped meals so they could eat, and now, when his back was bent and his hands shook, he had been told without words that his usefulness had expired. Max walked close, his shoulder brushing Frank's leg every few steps. The old dog paused now and then, glancing back as if checking whether Frank was still standing. That small gesture, so simple, so loyal, hurt more than the rejection ever could. "I'm all right," Frank murmured, though his voice trembled. "Just give me a minute." They stopped beneath a cluster of tall pines. The wind hissed through the branches, carrying the scent of wet earth and decay. Frank leaned against a tree, dizzy, his vision blurring at the edges. For a terrifying moment, he wondered if this was it, if he would collapse here, alone in the dark. Another forgotten old man the world would never miss. Max whined softly and pressed his body against Frank's legs, warm and solid. That warmth anchored him. Frank straightened slowly. "Okay," he whispered. "We keep moving." That was when Max froze. His ears lifted, his posture stiffened. Then, without pulling hard, he tugged the leash to the right, away from the path. "What is it?" Boy Frank asked. Max let out a low, insistent sound, not fear, but urgency. He led Frank through brush and low-hanging branches, until the trees opened just enough for something dark and unnatural to appear between them. A structure. Frank blinked, thinking his tired mind was playing tricks on him, but it remained solid, unmistakable. A cabin, half hidden by vines and shadows, its roof sagging slightly in the middle. One window was boarded up with crooked planks. The porch leaned, tired but standing, as if refusing to give up completely. Frank felt a faint spark stir in his chest. Hope. Weak, dangerous hope. "I've heard about this place," he muttered. Town gossip from years ago. People said it was cursed, that someone had died there, that bad things followed anyone who stayed too long. Frank didn't care. To a man with nowhere else to go, it didn't look cursed. It looked like shelter. He climbed the porch steps carefully, each one groaning under his weight. The door resisted at first, swollen from years of rain, then creaked open with a long, hollow sound that echoed through the trees. Inside, the air was stale and cold but dry. Frank stepped in and closed the door behind them. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. His eyes adjusted slowly, revealing a small, forgotten space, an old couch with torn cushions, a crooked table, a stone fireplace choked with ash. Frank exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Well," he said quietly, voice rough, "we've stayed in worse places, haven't we?" Max's tail wagged just once, but it was enough. Frank shrugged off his wet coat and draped it over a chair. His hands shook as he lowered himself onto the couch, exhaustion crashing over him all at once. Max jumped up beside him with effort, curling into a tight, familiar shape. His warmth seeped through Frank's soaked clothes. For the first time that night, Frank allowed his eyes to close. Not to sleep, he was too alert for that, but to breathe. Memories surfaced uninvited. His wife's laughter, his children's small hands wrapped around his fingers. Sunday dinners that felt like forever ago. He wondered when exactly everything had started slipping away, or if it had always been headed here. A loud crack of thunder jolted him. Max lifted his head, ears twitching. Then he growled. Frank opened his eyes. "Easy," he whispered. "It's just the storm." But Max didn't settle. He slid off the couch and padded toward the back of the cabin, stopping near a narrow door Frank hadn't noticed before. The dog sniffed, then pawed at the wood. Frank frowned. "What do you smell?" He rose slowly, joints protesting, and joined Max. The door led down into darkness. A basement. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the scent of damp stone and something else. Something old. Frank hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave it alone, to rest, to survive the night and worry about tomorrow when it came. But Max pawed again, insistent. "All right," Frank sighed. "Just a look." He found an old flashlight in a drawer. It flickered weakly as he clicked it on and stepped down the creaking stairs. At the bottom, Max went straight to one wall and began scratching. The sound was wrong. Hollow. Frank tapped the wall with his knuckles. The echo answered back, sharp and empty. His heart began to pound, not with fear, but with the sense that something was waiting. Something that would change everything. The beam of the flashlight trembled in Frank Reynolds' hand as he stared at the spot where Max kept scratching. The dog's nails scraped against the concrete, steady and determined, as if he knew without doubt that something was hidden there. "Easy, boy," Frank whispered, though his own pulse was racing. "You'll hurt your paws." Max ignored him. Frank crouched slowly, joints aching, and pressed his knuckles against the wall. He tapped once. Thud. Not solid. Not like the rest of the basement. Frank's stomach tightened. He tapped again, moving his hand slightly to the side. Thud. His breath caught. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. He scanned the basement with the flashlight until the weak beam landed on a rusty toolbox shoved beneath the stairs. Inside, he found an old metal pry bar, its handle worn smooth from use long ago. Whoever had left it behind hadn't expected anyone to come back. Frank hesitated. At his age, curiosity was a luxury. Trouble came easier than opportunity, but something about Max's certainty, about the hollow sound behind the wall felt deliberate, as if the cabin itself had been waiting. "All right," Frank said quietly. "Just careful." He wedged the pry bar into a thin crack near the base of the wall and leaned his weight against it. The concrete resisted, then shifted with a dull crack that echoed through the basement. Dust billowed into the air, making Frank cough. Max barked once, sharp and excited. Frank worked slowly, pausing often to catch his breath. Finally, a rectangular slab loosened and fell inward with a heavy thud, revealing darkness behind it. Not just darkness, a hidden doorway. Frank stared, stunned. The edges were clean, intentional. Someone hadn't patched this wall to repair it. They had sealed something away. His flashlight shook as he aimed it through the opening. The beam landed on stacked metal boxes, wooden crates, rolled canvases wrapped in yellowed cloth. Everything was dry, preserved, ordered. Frank stepped inside, his boots crunching softly on the floor. The air felt different here. Still, respectful, like a place meant to be left untouched. He lifted the flashlight higher, illuminating handwritten labels tied to the boxes with twine. Names, dates, cities. Vienna, 1943. Private collection. Property of... Frank's throat went dry. He didn't know much about art or history, but he knew enough to understand this wasn't junk. This wasn't forgotten clutter. This was valuable. His heart began to pound harder, not with excitement, but with something closer to fear. "Max?" he whispered. The dog stepped beside him, tail wagging gently, eyes bright but calm, as if to say, "You're not alone. You see it now." Frank sank onto one knee, suddenly dizzy. Money flashed through his mind uninvited. Warm meals, a heater that worked, a bed that didn't sag in the middle, medical bills paid without choosing which one to ignore. A small place where no one could tell him he didn't belong. At 74, the future had felt like a narrowing hallway. Now, suddenly, a door had cracked open. Frank reached out and touched one of the canvases. His fingers trembled. "No," he said quietly, pulling his hand back. "This isn't ours." The words surprised even him. He stood there a long time, the weight of the discovery pressing down on his chest. Someone had hidden these things for a reason, maybe to protect them, maybe to steal them, maybe because the world had become too dangerous to trust. Whatever the reason, the truth was simple. Frank had been abandoned by his children, forgotten by his neighbors, reduced to a burden. But this was bigger than his pain. He backed out of the hidden room and carefully pushed the slab back into place as best he could, concealing the opening. His hands were steady now. His mind was not. Back upstairs, the storm raged on. Wind battered the cabin walls, and rain drummed against the roof like impatient fingers. Frank sat on the couch, Max curled against his leg, and stared into the darkness. Sleep didn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boxes, the names, the dates, ghosts of lives interrupted. Families who never got to come back for what was theirs. By morning, he knew the choice would still be there. He could walk away and pretend he'd never found it. He could take something just enough to survive. Who would blame an old man with nothing? Or he could do what his father had taught him long ago, back when the world still made sense. Being poor isn't a failure. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Losing your integrity is... Frank looked down at Max, who slept peacefully, trusting him without question. All my life, Frank whispered into the quiet cabin, I tried to do right by people. The rain finally began to ease, the storm passing as slowly as it had come. But inside Frank Reynolds, a far greater storm was building, one that would force him to choose who he truly was. Now that everything else had been taken from him, morning arrived quietly, as if the storm had taken everything loud with it when it left. Pale light slipped through the grimy window of the cabin, cutting thin lines across the wooden floor. Frank Reynolds opened his eyes slowly, every muscle stiff, every joint reminding him of his age. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. Then he remembered. The cabin, the basement, the hidden room. Frank sat up, rubbing his face with trembling hands. Max lifted his head beside him, tail thumping once against the couch. The dog's eyes were calm, trusting, unburdened by the weight that sat heavy in Frank's chest. I didn't dream it, did I? Frank muttered. Max only yawned. Frank rose and walked to the window. Outside, the woods were washed clean by rain. Sunlight filtered through the trees, soft and almost kind. The world looked peaceful, cruelly, so like nothing had changed at all. But everything had. All his life, Frank had believed that if you worked hard, loved your family, and stayed honest, things would somehow work out. That belief had carried him through long shifts at the garage, through scraped knuckles and aching backs, through the years when money was tight but hope was still alive. Now, standing in a forgotten cabin with nothing but an old dog and a secret worth more than his entire lifetime of labor. That belief felt fragile. Frank poured himself a cup of water from a dusty jug he'd found the night before, and sat at the crooked table, his hands wrapped around the cup, seeking warmth. This is your chance, a quiet voice whispered inside him. Not a greedy voice, a practical one. He pictured a small apartment, clean, warm, a place where Max could lie in the sun by a window. He imagined walking into a grocery store without counting every dollar, going to the doctor without fear of the bill, living his remaining years with dignity instead of fear. No one would know, he said aloud. Max looked up. Frank sighed. I know. His thoughts drifted, uninvited, to his children, to the way they avoided his eyes when they told him it would be best if he moved out, to how quickly love had turned into inconvenience, to how easily they'd close the door. For a bitter moment, Frank felt the sharp edge of resentment. They took everything from me, he thought. Why shouldn't I take something back from the world? He stood abruptly and walked toward the basement door. Each step felt heavier than the last. The stairs creaked as he descended. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the space itself was holding its breath. Frank pulled the slab aside again, revealing the hidden room. In the daylight, the contents looked even more deliberate, more human. Frank stepped inside slowly. He knelt beside one of the boxes and traced the handwritten label with his finger. A name, not a number, not a code. A name that once belonged to someone who loved, hoped, planned for a future just like he had. Frank swallowed hard. These weren't hidden to be forgotten, he whispered. They were hidden to be saved. Suddenly, the discovery no longer felt like an opportunity. It felt like a responsibility. Frank leaned back against the wall, eyes burning. He thought of his father, A quiet man who'd work the docks and come home exhausted every night. A man who'd never owned much but had slept soundly, knowing he'd never taken what wasn't his. You can lose your house, his father used to say. You can lose your money. But once you lose your character, you've got nothing left. Frank closed his eyes. At 74, stripped of family and security, this choice would define the story of his life more than anything that came before it. If he took even one item, everything after would be built on a lie. If he did the right thing, the outcome was uncertain. Painfully uncertain. Frank stood. "All right," he said softly, voice steady for the first time in days. "We do this right. Back upstairs." Max watched him carefully as Frank gathered his coat and straightened the cabin as best he could. He moved with purpose now, not urgency, but clarity. "We were going back to town," Frank told him. "Not for them, for us." The walk felt different this time. Still long, still cold, but Frank's back was straighter, his steps more certain. He wasn't walking towards a comfort. He was walking toward truth. As the town came into view, Frank felt fear creep in of being dismissed, ignored, laughed at. An old man with a story too big to believe. Max pressed close, as if sensing it. "Whatever happens," Frank whispered, "I'm glad I didn't choose the easy way." The police station stood ahead, brick and unremarkable. Frank paused at the door, hand resting on the handle. This was the moment where everything could change, or nothing at all. He took a breath and stepped inside. The bell above the police station door rang softly as Frank Reynolds stepped inside, rainwater dripping from his coat onto the worn tile floor. The warmth hit him first, then the smell of old paper and coffee. It felt like another world compared to the cold uncertainty he'd left behind. A young officer behind the front desk looked up, surprised to see an elderly man with a muddy dog standing so calmly at the entrance. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. Frank nodded, clearing his throat. His voice came out steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. "I need to report something I found." He said, "It's unusual." The officer raised an eyebrow but gestured for him to continue. "There's an abandoned cabin in the woods," Frank explained. "Inside, there's a hidden room. It's full of old paintings, documents, things that don't belong to anyone alive out there now. I didn't touch them. I came straight here." Silence hung between them. The officer studied Frank's face, then glanced down at Max, who sat patiently at his feet. Something about the man's posture upright despite exhaustion made her pick up the phone. Within minutes, Frank found himself seated in a small interview room, a paper cup of coffee warming his hands. Another officer joined them, then another. Questions followed, careful, detailed, respectful. No one laughed, no one dismissed him. For the first time in years, Frank felt seen. By midday, unmarked vehicles were rolling toward the cabin. Experts arrived, historians, investigators, people who spoke in hushed voices and took photographs of everything. Frank stood to the side, answering questions when asked. Max never leaving his leg. One of the men, a tall gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes, turned to Frank after several hours. "You did the right thing," he said simply. Those words hit Frank harder than he expected. News traveled fast in a small town. By the next morning, whispers had turned into headlines. The cabin. The hidden collection. Art and documents believed lost during wartime, items taken from families who had fled and never returned. Reporters gathered outside the station. Cameras flashed. Frank avoided them all. He didn't want attention. He wanted peace. But peace came with consequences. That afternoon, Frank heard a voice he hadn't expected to hear again. Dad. He turned slowly. His daughter stood there, eyes wide, face tight with something that looked like regret or fear. Behind her, his son hovered, hands in his pockets. Suddenly unsure of himself, "We saw the news," she said softly. "We didn't know it was you." Frank said nothing. His son cleared his throat. "We were worried. We thought maybe you'd gotten confused, or that someone took advantage of you." Frank finally met his eyes. "I wasn't confused," he said quietly, "and no one took advantage of me." Silence stretched. "Well," his daughter said, forcing a smile, "everything's different now. Maybe you could come back home. We can talk about arrangements." Arrangements? The word settled heavy in Frank's chest. He looked at them. Really looked. The sudden warmth in their voices, the careful choice of words, the way their eyes flicked just once toward the reporters outside. Frank felt no anger, only clarity. "I didn't come here for money," he said, "and I didn't do this to change your minds." Max let out a low, protective rumble. Frank rested a hand on the dog's head. "I came because it was the right thing to do." His children exchanged glances. "We'll call you," his daughter said. Frank nodded. "You know where to find me?" They left. Frank didn't watch them go. Days later, the investigation concluded. Authorities confirmed the value of the recovered items, millions of dollars, but more importantly, they traced surviving family lines. Plans were made to return what could be returned. Museums and embassies became involved. And then came the letter. A plain envelope, official seal. Frank opened it slowly, hands shaking. Inside was a formal notice and a check. A finder's reward, granted legally for his honesty and cooperation. The amount made his breath catch. Frank sat down heavily, Max jumping up beside him. "Well," Frank whispered, staring at the paper, "would you look at that?" But instead of excitement, what he felt was something quieter. Relief. Not because he was suddenly wealthy, but because the fear that had followed him for years loosened its grip. He could afford warmth, food, care, a future that didn't depend on anyone's mercy. A social worker helped him find a small home on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just clean, warm, safe. On move-in day, Frank sat on the porch with Max at his feet, sunlight on his face. For the first time since the night he'd been turned away, Frank allowed himself to believe this wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new one. The quiet that followed the chaos felt unfamiliar to Frank Reynolds. In the small rental house on the edge of town, mornings arrived gently. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains. Birds gathered on the fence outside. Max slept longer now, curled into a warm patch on the rug, his breathing slow and content. For years, Frank had lived braced for impact, waiting for criticism, rejection, or the next reminder that he was no longer needed. Now, with the basics finally secure, something unexpected surfaced. Emptiness. Not loneliness, but the strange absence of fear. Frank discovered that safety left room for memories. Some were kind, many were not. He found himself waking at night, replaying moments he hadn't thought about in decades, birthdays he missed because of work, arguments he brushed aside, times he assumed love would always be there because it always had been. He wondered if he'd failed as a father, or if the world had simply changed faster than he could follow. One afternoon, a social worker named Grace Holloway stopped by to check in. She was kind without being patronizing, attentive without prying. "How are you settling in?" she asked. sitting across from him at the small kitchen table. Frank considered the question. "I'm learning," he said slowly, "that I don't have to apologize for taking up space." Grace smiled. "That's a hard lesson, especially for people who spent their lives providing for others." Her words stayed with him. Frank began small. He took morning walks with Max through the neighborhood, nodding to people instead of avoiding eye contact. He visited the local diner, choosing a booth by the window. The first time he ordered without checking prices. His hands shook. No one told him to hurry up. No one sighed when he spoke. Slowly, the knot in his chest loosened. One evening, Frank drove back to the woods. The cabin stood exactly as he'd left it. Weathered, quiet, patient. He parked the car and stepped out, Max trotting ahead like he remembered the way. Frank didn't go inside. He sat on the porch steps instead, letting the memories wash over him. That night had nearly broken him. And yet, it had also revealed who he was when everything else was stripped away. Honest, capable, still worthy. "I don't hate them," Frank said softly to Max, as if confessing something important. "I just don't belong there anymore." Max wagged his tail, unconcerned with the past. Over the following weeks, Frank made a decision that surprised even himself. With guidance from Grace and a local volunteer group, he began the paperwork to turn the cabin into a temporary shelter, not fancy, not permanent, but safe. A place for elderly men and women who had been pushed aside, forgotten, or quietly abandoned. "I don't want recognition," Frank told the group. "I just want one less person sleeping scared." They respected that. Frank helped clean the cabin, patch the roof, replace the worst of the boards. He worked slowly, carefully, listening to his body instead of fighting it like he used to. Max supervised every step. Word spread not through headlines, but through gratitude. A man who'd lost his wife and home stayed for 2 nights. A woman, estranged from her family, left behind a handwritten thank you note. No one asked Frank about the money. They asked about the dog. At night, Frank returned home, tired but fulfilled in a way he hadn't felt since his children were young. He cooked simple meals. He slept deeply. One afternoon, his phone rang. A number he hadn't saved. Frank stared at it for a long moment before answering. Dad, and his son's voice asked, hesitant. Frank closed his eyes. "I'm okay," he said gently, before anything else could be said. "You don't need to worry." There was a pause. "We heard about the cabin, about what you're doing." Frank waited. "I don't need anything," Frank continued. "And I'm not angry. I just want you to understand something." Another pause. "I'm not invisible," Frank said, "and I won't live like I am." When the call ended, Frank felt no triumph, no bitterness, only peace. That night, he sat on his porch beside Max, the air warm and still. For the first time in a long while, Frank wasn't measuring his worth by who needed him or who didn't. He was enough, not because of what he'd found, not because of what he'd lost, but because, when tested, he had chosen integrity over bitterness and compassion over regret, and that choice had changed him forever. Autumn arrived softly, without ceremony. Leaves turned gold and drifted across the dirt road leading to the cabin. Settling into corners Frank Reynolds had once swept with his own hands. The air grew crisp, carrying the smell of pine and wood smoke. It was the kind of season Frank used to love back when life felt full and predictable. Now, it felt meaningful. Frank stood on the porch of the cabin, a thermos of coffee in one hand, watching Max wander nearby. The dog moved slower these days, but his tail still wagged with quiet confidence. like a man who knew he was exactly where he belonged. So was Frank. The cabin no longer looked abandoned. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid, warm, welcoming. A light always burned inside at night, not bright enough to draw attention, just enough to guide someone who needed it. Frank had insisted on that. "You don't need a sign," he told the volunteers. "If someone's looking for help, they'll see the light." And they did. People came quietly and left quietly. No questions asked. No judgments made. Frank learned their names when they offered them, listened when they wanted to talk, and understood when they didn't. He never asked why they'd been left behind. He already knew the answer. Life moved forward, not loudly, not dramatically, but with purpose. Frank still had moments of sadness. Certain songs on the radio still caught him off guard. He still felt the ache of knowing his children were living their lives without him in them, but the ache no longer defined him. One afternoon, as Frank repaired a loose railing, Max sat watching the trees sway in the wind. A car pulled up slowly, unfamiliar. A woman stepped out, holding an envelope. "Mr. Reynolds?" she asked gently. Frank nodded. "I'm from one of the families," she said. "The ones who lost everything during the war. The painting, the documents, they belong to my grandparents." Frank felt his chest tighten. She handed him the envelope. "We wanted to thank you. Not for the money, for the honesty. Because of you. We finally know what happened." Frank didn't open it right away. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why it matters." After she left, Frank sat on the porch steps for a long time, the envelope unopened beside him. When he finally looked inside, it wasn't money, just a letter, pages filled with gratitude, history, and closure. Frank wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Well," he murmured to Max, "guess doing the right thing echoes farther than we think." As winter approached, Frank's health wavered slightly. Nothing serious, just reminders that time moves in one direction. He learned to rest when his body asked him to. He accepted help without shame. That, too, was growth. On a quiet evening, Frank sat by the fire in his small home. Max curled at his feet. Outside, snow fell gently, covering the world in silence. Frank stared into the flames, reflecting on the strange path that had brought him here. He had lost his family. He had lost his home. He had lost the version of himself that believed love was guaranteed. But he had gained something deeper. Self-respect, purpose, peace. Frank realized then that legacy wasn't about what you left behind for people who walked away. It was about what you offered to those who showed up when it mattered. Months later, Frank received a handwritten card from a man who'd stayed at the cabin for a single night. "You didn't save my life," the note read, "but you reminded me it was still worth living." Frank folded the card carefully and placed it in a small wooden box beside the fireplace. Inside were others like it, quiet proofs that kindness, even when unnoticed, never disappeared. On a spring morning, not long after, Frank and Max walked the familiar path near the woods. The sun filtered through new leaves. Birds sang without fear. Frank paused, breathing deeply. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think being abandoned meant I didn't matter." Max looked up at him. "Turns out," Frank continued, smiling, "it just meant my story wasn't finished yet." He rested a hand on Max's head, fingers sinking into familiar fur. Together, they walked on, not chasing recognition, not seeking forgiveness, but carrying something far more powerful. A life reclaimed, a conscience intact, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that even when the world turns its back, doing what's right can still change everything. Frank Reynolds' story is not about hidden treasure or sudden fortune. It's about what remains when family walks away, when comfort disappears, and when life strips a person down to their quietest truth. Frank learned that being abandoned does not mean being worthless. Sometimes, it simply means the wrong people walked away. The right ones, compassion, purpose, self-respect were still waiting. This story reminds us that the measure of a life is not found in how others treat us at our weakest, but in how we choose to act when the world turns cold. If this story touched you, subscribe for more stories about second chances. And if someone you know feels forgotten, share this with them. Sometimes, doing the right thing changes everything.